All right, well, welcome everyone. Welcome to this episode of Lean In Olympia. I'm really glad you're here with us. My name is Corey Passons. I'm here with Interfaith Works. Interfaith Works is a social justice nonprofit organization here in Olympia, Washington. We serve Thurston County. We're a coalition of 30 plus diverse spiritual and faith communities and affiliated organizations, and we're also the region's largest social service provider to homeless adults or to vulnerable adults experiencing homelessness. So I'm really glad you're here. I'm glad to be here with Interfaith Works. You can catch past episodes of Lean in Olympia on our website at interfaith-works.org and our Facebook page. And also we're starting to stream this as a podcast on Spotify as well. So look for that too. And we'll have links to that on our website. I'm very thrilled today to welcome our guest today, Jerad Keopp. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to be here. We've just had a whole episode and conversation before this filming, but we're going to recap some of those points, and we're not going to recap some of those points too. But I want to just do a brief introduction and bio, and then you can tell me if I get anything not quite right. You are the Native Student Program Specialist for North Thurston Public Schools. And Jerad works throughout the district, primarily with Native American students, but also with faculty, administrators, and regional tribal governments. And you were named and functioned as the 2022 Washington State Teacher of the Year. Congratulations. And traveled to Washington, D.C., met Dr. Joe Biden.
Yeah, and have had a whole lot of wonderful time traveling our state to visit other districts, both ESDs, high schools, elementary schools, and just it's a wonderful opportunity to recognize and celebrate and lift up all of our state's incredible educators.
That's so good. And I wanted to share just one more brief piece of background on your bio, and we'll talk about your work too. And you've been a teacher for 16 years, is that right? Or is it 17 now?
Sounds about right.
Okay, right around there.
A long time.
8 of which has been, the last 8 years has been as the Native Student Program Specialist. And your role extends well beyond the classroom. This is what I've come to see in some of the videos, and we'll talk about that too. And I just wanted to share this quote because I think it's great. And if I were in your chair, I would want someone to read a quote about me, like this is about you. So this is from Kate Frazier, who's the Director of Equity and Languages at North Thurston Public Schools. She says that within 2 years, our district adopted a land acknowledgement, flies the Nisqually flag at every district site, and coordinates government-to-government consultation meetings between the Nisqually Tribal Council and our school board. Mr. Keopp is by far one of the most transformative leaders and teachers I've ever had the privilege to work with. I thought that was a great quote, and just from getting quotes like that from your peers is just a really special thing. Yeah. So thank you for being here. And I also just wanted to note that you have a quote talking about how you provide cultural and academic support to 230 Native American students from over 50 tribes. That's accurate?
Yeah. I think it what's really great about numbers like that is it really shows that there is a large scope to the work, but it also helps to illustrate the vast diversity of Native people across Turtle Island. So not only do we have a lot of students and usually not many people to provide support for those students, but we also have a lot of unique experiences within those tribal relationships and citizenships that students have. But each one of those individual experiences presents itself differently. So the job has to be as diverse and as flexible as the students that we serve.
Wow. Yeah. And for some of the ways that you help the students are with classwork and academics, but also cultural education as well. And you work in small groups, large groups, professional development, and I want to come back to and explore the specifics of the work that you do because I just think it's fascinating. But I also was wondering if you could kind of help us know a little bit more about you and tell us where you're from.
Well, I originally grew up in Richland in Eastern Washington. My parents met in California in the 70s, and my dad is from the Tri-Cities. So they met, they moved back home. I grew up and I was surrounded by, I think, just so many incredible and influential teachers. About the time I was born, my dad was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disease. And you can imagine, sort of the trauma and challenges that provides a child growing up, with your father in intensive care units on a regular basis in between remissions. And I just felt so incredibly fortunate to have so many teachers that always saw what I was going through, understood what my family needed. And so those relationships with school and also being an only child were a really great opportunity for me to be in community and see education as a world of possibilities as well as opportunities. And and then once I, got into high school, I ended up having an experience in a math class. I had a really just terrible math teacher senior year. And I remember her coming into class one Monday morning, and she was ranting and raving about this math conference that she went to at this dirty hippie college. And like I hated going to this class every day, but when she was like in this mood talking about this dirty hippie college, I just leaned in. I was like, please say the name. And she said it was at the Evergreen State College. And I thought to myself in that moment that if this is the complete opposite of you, this is the place for me. And Evergreen was the only place I applied to, and I got 2 degrees from. And it's once you spend some time in Olympia, it's hard to leave. So
That's an amazing story about how teachers can influence in unexpected ways too.
yeah, the important takeaway from that is not that traumatizing your students can lead to success, but I think the takeaway is that I grew up in an environment with so many amazing teachers that I knew I could weather the bad ones.
Do you name any or have any like people beyond the words teachers, like mentors from growing up that might extend beyond educational spaces?
Yeah, well, and I think a lot of it is just sort of that indigenous background, right? That within Western society, a teacher is someone who's had the opportunity and privilege to get their name on a really expensive piece of paper. But when we connect to just sort of like the way that we are as human beings, people and other than humans are all teachers, right? And so once we open ourselves up, we realize like not only how much smaller our world is, but how much more we have to learn from all sorts of unexpected places.
Can we talk about your tribal affiliation as you begin to reference that?
Yeah, so I'm Wukchumni. It's a small tribe from Central California. We're in the foothills of the Sierra Nevadas, and it's not a tribe that most people have heard of, which caused some unique situations growing up as a mixed race child. Because I remember I might mention I was Native American, and I'd usually see a non-native adult just get really excited, anticipating I'd say some famous tribe. And I'd say who my people are, and they inevitably get disappointed because they didn't feel they couldn't self-congratulate for like their cultural awareness. And, our people's lack of familiarity with who we are, it has a lot to say about this nation's history with Native people. Prior to contact, what is now California had the highest population density anywhere north of Mexico. And in the 30 years after the discovery of gold in 1849, about 80% of the California indigenous population was killed through starvation, disease, and outright genocide. And some people may find, the term genocide contentious because of its etymological origins in 1944. But, politicians, government leaders, newspapers were very liberal in their use and support for extermination programs. One, for example, stated in 1861 that a mean digger only becomes a good Indian when he's dangling at the end of a rope or has an ounce of lead in him. And my great-great-grandfather, John Martin Davis, was identified as a digger in the Indian census. And digger is a racial epithet used to dehumanize particularly California Native people, because it also removes us from any sort of sovereign tribal identity. And so the effects of this American extermination project dwindled us down. So in the 1910 Indian census, only 25 of my ancestors were identified.
Wow.
So at one point, like all the Wukchumni in the world could have fit in a classroom. And I think that tells a really powerful story. But it also is a big source of my inspiration because my ancestors didn't use their brilliance to survive for me not to live my best life.
Were there living mentors and teachers from that tribe that were part of your upbringing or influenced you?
Yeah. But my cultural upbringing was interesting, but it also tells a story of survival. So, when for most of American history, it has been dangerous or deadly to be Native. And so when my great-grandmother Pearl finally kind of moved into town and started, raising my my great aunts and my grandma, she refused to teach her children the language because it's dangerous. And so this idea of like this long-term survival and these unimaginable choices of thinking like, well, I have to put the culture to sleep. And so being raised white-coated was in the interest of our long-term survival. So the value of whiteness as a tool, even if you clearly do not look white, especially for folks like my grandma, can play out, in the long run, right? If the game and its rules are followed the way that we're told, this might get us a little bit further. And so for example, my mom growing up, she mentioned, I think in junior high in class that she was Native, and she ended up being suspended. And there was a really powerful story I heard growing up, and her mom said, it's like, well, it's good to be proud of who you are, but we can't say that. And so I remember growing up, my mom at a young age, being going to powwows and going with her to bead stores and just having fun, sticking my little fingers into hanks of beads until she told me to stop because it messes up the beads. But then I also remember, I think, kind of hitting a certain age where like that was like we just kind of stopped doing that, right? And I kind of understood as much as a child could at the moment, like that I was kind of here to kind of to grow up white-coated, and that this language and the knowledge of these systems would someday be key to unlocking the liberation that would eventually come. And if I was to fulfill my ancestors' wildest dreams, I needed to understand and speak the language of the oppressors in order to find those pathways for liberation, but to also dismantle its systems of violence.
Are you saying that as a child you were understanding you were processing these incredibly subtle balances with holding and operating in white supremacy norms to maintain cultural survivalship? Is that what you're saying? Like that's amazing to have that be that awareness.
Yeah, I would say I think the only unique thing that I think gave me an advantage was being an only child, because only children tend to attach more to adults. So I think I was just spending so much more time with adults than my peers. I mean, I had lots of wonderful friends growing up, but to be able to kind of learn and watch adult behavior and to see how people move through different roles throughout their lives, really, I think I just learned a lot through observing. I think there's also a little bit of element of just trying to bring my best self to people. And so, trying to be attentive to people's behavior to also kind of tend to what they are, but also look out for myself, I think.
So when did you begin to move towards education? Was this part of the degree from Evergreen?
Yeah, wait, yeah. So, I've been inspired so many times by teachers and saw the impact that they made. And I knew that was something I was always really passionate about. I first came over here to study, some political science, and took a little bit of time off, and then made up my mind that I would get into education. And then, I had, something of a pivotal moment in a calling that called me specifically to specialize in a Native education, which, I mean, in Washington State and a few other states in particular, like that's becoming more of an option. But, taking what I learned and then moving into these places were all things I had to assert. So as I sort of decided that now is the time to present more, but also to reattach and reconnect with my culture, would also come with the additional responsibility of having to create that space, not only for myself, but for the people that would come after me within these rather traditional spaces of education.
I can't, as a minister, I can't hear you say something like I had a calling in a specific moment without asking about it. So what, in your own words, in your own way, what was that experience like for you, and what happened what formulated in your mind or your being that would fit the words that you used for calling?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's not something I've told many people, but you kind of hit those moments where you have a lot of options laid out before you, right? And then there's something within us, right? So whether it's some form of genetic memory, messaging that we're picking up that says like these are the options, but this is what you're meant to do here. And really kind of like after that, I was just like, this is what I'm doing, because I had the inkling. But, anyone who's kind of set out to engage in a new endeavor, in whatever sort of field that speaks to you, you kind of hit those moments where you hit that, that wall of challenge, and you need some sort of inspiration or push to remind you of your purpose in that space. And that was one of those things that really set me in the right direction, I think, with the encouragement that I needed to keep up the work.
Thank you for that. I appreciate you sharing in that way, what that experience was like for you to turn towards that.
Yeah. And thanks for digging into that.
Yeah, no, I mean, that sounds like a very important moment. And there are aspects of what I'd like to talk about with your students that relate to words like becoming or identity. And that just feels like a moment where you were personally showing up to a calling within you.
Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned the word pride earlier, and I came across a quote from you. I don't have the quote, but I have kind of a summary of it, where you talk about pride in your students.
Yeah.
And in a general way. And pride is a word that can be fraught. It can be taught in a way for it to be, cautioned against or to be dangerous. But there's also, I think, something else going on with what you were talking about, with a kind of pride in seeing that become in your students. But I'm assuming you're talking about students of Native background too when you talk about this. So could you tell us about what you might be celebrating when you talk about pride in your students?
Yeah. So I think within the context of your question, some of what you're getting at is pride requires, I think, often quite a bit of courage and confidence, but it is also reflective of the safety and inclusion of the space in which you inhabit. And so, we don't have all the time in the world to get into it, but we have a lot of structural problems, right? And Native educators understand particularly that the public education system, the history of education in this country, has been something that has been done to us. And I think a lot of other people can relate. Sort of the indoctrination and the assimilation that runs deep within the United States, right? These ideas of whiteness, that sort of the violence against Native people isn't just about dispossession, isn't just violence against their bodies. It's also about colonizing their minds. And because we have this long history of intergenerational trauma within educational spaces, that because there's one of me for so many of our children, one of the things that I see as long term, and I think one of the benefits of growing up the way that I did, is that I understand, I guess, my role is something of an institutional insurgent, right? That I was raised with the privileges with which to see these systems operate, so that I could bend them towards justice. And so those moments of pride, manifest in all sorts of exciting ways, like creating like school programs and working with staff and celebrating student identity, where students want to and feel safe and proud to wear regalia for school photos, right? Wearing this for graduation, this eagle feather, will keep you from walking or keep you from graduating in still many states in this country.
I didn't know that until I was starting to research your work.
Yeah. And so our state has long been a leader in encouraging what we call right to regalia, for example. And when we were doing all of our policy work, like you mentioned in the intro, one of the things that I really wanted to push, and I still encourage all of our districts in our state to do this, is I encourage our district to create a right to regalia policy, and so our district did a few days before the state. And even though the state, it's now an RCW, students have the right to wear items of cultural significance and regalia. It's also important to make sure that we take the time to pass those district policies, because most people in education don't read RCWs for pleasure, and we certainly can't assume that our families are going to, right? So we may have these legal rights, but if they're not known by anyone, who are they serving? Like, what is it serving? So, one easy way to make an immediate win as an ally in your district is work on, how can we take this RCW and get it front and center into a student handbook, so that our students and families and our allies in school have the tools that we need to make a more inclusive environment for our students, and help remove that history of trauma, right? Because Native people, we're inherently dual citizens, right? And when for example, I think tying into your kind of your topics of faith, right? That whatever this is on becomes a religious garment. But for most school people, and I think most of Americans, because of Hollywood portrayals and the settler colonial narratives that we learn in school, this becomes often called a costume, right? Because no one would ever consider asking any other faith to remove a religious garment, but most Americans have no problem asking us to remove this, right? And so that is sort of like that hidden in plain sight danger, where everyone is impacted by these systems of invisibility and erasure. So it's not so much. So it's great for those students to have those moments, but I think the real impact of seeing that pride is that we're reclaiming those spaces.
And all that said, with with the policies and the RCW in place, even still, I think that there's something that you talk about the work that you do is showing up as you.
Yeah.
Right. And so for them to have like context for what it means to have rights of regalia versus just having a policy. Like they're not, what I'm trying to get at is that what you're trying to do with your work is show them that they're not alone in living into those policies.
Yeah.
Like if it were a student that just researched a policy and did it on their own, that'd be a very different experience for them, I think, than having your support and other students around them, supporting them as they do that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's a difference of like mandated inclusion or a culture of inclusion, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And sometimes we just need that little bit of support mm-hmm. For people who are coming in to the work to like have that sense of encouragement that no, the state believes this, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's also really important for districts developing their government-to-government relationships, mm-hmm. right? That everywhere we go on Turtle Island, we are on native land. Mm-hmm. All of our districts in this state benefit from indigenous dispossession, right? Mm-hmm. And, through a growing number of bills, like districts are required to engage in tribal consultation and mm-hmm. collaboration. One of those bills, House Bill 1426, I was a co-author on because we have so many inconsistencies in implementation and all sorts of things that what I saw was a big hurdle was that administrators didn't have the opportunities for the professional development that they needed mm-hmm. in order to be confident and have the necessary training and competence to engage in tribal consultation work. So we wanted to make sure that we got it written down. Mm-hmm. And so now that will become a regular part of who we are as Washington State. So
that's great.
It's really important that most people want to be allies, mm-hmm. but we have to also remember that we need to put in the systems. Sometimes mm-hmm. we got to tear down systems, but we need to always be building and creating new systems and opportunities so everyone has the tools and access they need mm-hmm. to be as supportive as they possibly can.
Mm-hmm. So are you a part of a team then that does the work that you do?
Well, for a number of years, it was just me. Mm-hmm. So, I have a couple hundred students, but I have colleagues in this line of work in the state that there's one of them for 3 districts.
Wow.
One of them, or maybe 2 for 900 students.
Wow, yeah.
So that's for me where the system work is so important. Yeah. Because I can't always be with all of our students mm-hmm. To provide that direct student support. But the mm-hmm. one thing that I can do with the limited amount of me and the limited amount of my time is work to make their school system, mm-hmm. whether on the building level, the classroom level, or on the state level, mm-hmm. a more inclusive and educated space for them, so mm-hmm. that they have the tools with which to thrive. Mm-hmm. Because I can help one student one-on-one. Mm-hmm. I can train a teacher to help 30 students mm-hmm. 6 times a day. I can train a building, 1,400 students. Mm-hmm. I can train a district, tens of thousands, right? And then the state, right? So all of these things have an impact. So it's always sort of a balancing act of reach. Yeah. But it's always the time with students that really fills the cup and fills the heart.
Yeah. So describe what those classrooms look like. Are these primarily like all Native students that are in the classrooms that you're working in?
Yeah. So it also says a lot about who we are as a state mm-hmm. with the diversity of educators that we recognize as Teachers of the Year, right? Mm-hmm. I'm not a traditional classroom teacher. Mm-hmm. And I think that's pretty awesome. Mm-hmm. And so I provide, when I provide student support, and we have programs in a couple of our schools where we try to have as regular hours as possible. Mm-hmm. So sometimes, we'll hang out with kids on recess. Sometimes we'll have open office hours. Sometimes we'll do study groups. We'll do cultural education. And a lot of the times, so many students and all of their identities and cultures, we just need space. because it's so hard to be in these big areas of school that are crowded, and we don't have enough of a chance to just kind of come together and be ourselves and be with people, even though we all may have like diverse experiences and positions within our indigenous identities. Like we all have this commonality. So that's a big part of what we do. I do quite a bit of guest teaching in the district, so we have that support. Do a lot of staff training and development. But I would say the thing that's probably keeping me the busiest now is of the many list of things I think helped get me to be Washington State Teacher of the Year was that I was asked by an incredible friend and administrator friend of mine if I would be interested in creating a Native Studies class. And at first I said no. Because I'm used, because we just get used to people like, you don't know what you're asking for.
I see. Okay.
And that was some of my bias. Like, you don't know what I've had like non-Native people like ask this, and they're not invested in the work. They're not going to put in the time and the money, because if you're going to ask me to do this, we're going to like desettle and decolonize the space. I'm not just going to have a few more Native books in a regular history class. And so I thought about it a couple of minutes, and I told him I'm in, and that did a lot to make history. He paired me with an incredible teacher, one of the finest, if not finest teacher I've ever had the pleasure of working with, Allison McCartan. And so she teaches our Native U.S. history class, and she just took on
in the same district, or she more?
Same district. So this is out of River Ridge High School, just down the road a ways. And then just this year we added a new 12th grade Native Civics class, and then we brought back our 11th grade Native Literature class. So we have 3 Native Studies classes that are largely community taught. We have all sorts of tribal leaders from across the United States. We have students, all sorts of knowledge and culture bearers, and we're also really happy to have gotten it recently dual credited, because we have, when we get into education that reflects our students, it's not weighted by the overall system, right? Because you have it's not just you have a gatekeeper, you have hierarchies of gatekeeping. And so I was hearing students struggling with having to choose between AP and Native U.S. history. Like, well, that's not equity. And so thankfully, like City University like showed up and it's like, we're in. And because like, one, we have to validate the knowledge as meaningful, but not only just knowledgeable and meaningful for Native students, but for all students. And not only for all students, but that them coming with that knowledge into higher education is going to improve higher education, which is going to improve our connectedness as a community, right? So there's all these long-term impacts that we can make in this really exciting field of Native education.
And connection with the regional tribes too, because did you mention specifically the Nisqually Civics option, and there's a language component too going on, right?
Yeah, so we are really happy to work with the Nisqually tribe. Our district has work sessions with them formally twice a year, but they join us regularly to share their experiences and their knowledges. We've partnered with them, co-authored legislation with some of them. Like we have a pretty good group of friends out there. We have students from our other schools that go out to their culture center. We have some fantastic science teachers and other educators that we just kind of, our district and the Nisqually tribe, I think is a really incredible story of two communities that are willing to have the tough conversations, to learn about each other's history, and then put in the work and the commitment to heal, because like we all share this space together, and we all need to have an equal space at the table to provide what's best for our students. Because regardless of how people feel about education, I really think that at the end of the day that we're all coming from the heart, and we're all trying to do what we think is best for students. And so if we have two governments coming together, I think the outcomes really benefit everyone.
it's really inspirational to hear about, because something we did talk about when we were just gathering to get ready to do this today is about the concept of truth telling. And you mentioned the word healing, and there is no healing without truth or without true engagement
Yeah.
in the wound or whatever history is there that needs to be taught or known. And yet there's also a kind of growing culture of resistance to the kind of truth telling that is hard for colonizers to hear about.
Yeah.
And it sounds like what's happening in your district is that there is actually some cultures of acceptance and celebration of truth telling going on. And I just think that's really great.
Yeah, and it's so much that schools love to talk a lot about belonging, and I think without the sort of like the cultural knowledge and nuance, belonging can also seem to convey a sense of possession, right? What are the costs of my belonging, right? As a Native person, that's been the point of education. You belong to us. We'll cut your hair. We'll take your clothes. We'll steal your language. We'll ban your faith, right? All your spirituality, because our right to practice our religions wasn't recognized until 1978. But you'll belong to a school, right? We'll have like good sense of school belonging. And I think a lot of this reconnecting to individuals as people is that. It's like, yeah, we're happy to invite the Nisqually to be active partners and participants in student learning, but it's also, I think, even more impactful for people to understand that they have been so incredibly gracious and supportive to consistently invite our district into their community, because that part, I think, is easy to overlook. In the process, and once we kind of be in those spaces together, we learn more about each other. We can connect more, because at the end of the day, we're all human beings.
Yeah, I love that. I love that story, and it sounds like it's continuing to grow and emerge too. So that's really inspiring.
Yeah,
I wanted to ask about the lives of your students, and what would you say? I mean, we're protecting their their specifics of their lives, but what are they dealing with in their lives?
Yeah, that's the other thing. So if you're looking at sort of general risk factors, right? Like the Native American student and their academic risk factors have remained largely unchanged since the results of the 1928 Merriam Report, right? And it's really easy to start thinking about, well, what are the deficits, right? There's poverty, there's abuse, there's malnutrition, high unemployment in reservation communities. The list goes on, right? I was like, well, no. The one constant is colonization, right? The education system hasn't changed, right? Because we did fine for thousands of years living very full and happy lives, right? Educating our children, civilization has been a curse, I think, to Native people. Because if you think about it, like, we never had jails. We didn't have prisons. We didn't have judges or police or a police state, right? We did fine. We didn't have homelessness, right? But, as Europeans came over, like, all of these things kind of kept coming. And so we do have a higher proportion of at-risk students, as the data say, but we really just kind of see our students kind of living the tough realities of life, and our job is to unlock all of the assets that they have, to realize their own power and strength, to not only to self-heal, but to find the meaning in the life that they need, to follow the path that is most meaningful to them. And then also being mindful of nurturing those assets in the long-term goal of helping them build their nation. And I think that's a unique aspect when we think about Native education is that we're ultimately contributing to nation building. But our student population is just as diverse as the tribes they represent. So, we have our most at-risk students, just like any other school or student population. And then we have our students that I guess do pretty fine. But every student goes just like humans. We all have good days. We all have bad days for reasons sometimes we have control over. A lot of times we don't. And so I think because Native education is so, I think, predisposed to start from the heart, that we understand that the number one thing that students come for is connection, right? We need to be grounded. Sometimes a student might need a smudge, to have a little bit of ceremony to kind of, reconnect. And sometimes they just need a safe place to chill. And so it really, we always have to be adaptable to the needs of the student. And I think the best educators, and through years of experience, understand how to identify those cues. But really, it's just about being present with them, being honest with them, because our children have the keenest sense of fairness. And it's sad that I think so many of us lose that as we become adults, because I think that's like the real beauty of their humanity.
I want to earmark that fairness topic, but I wanted to ask, kind of dive into some of the things you were talking about with students and doing some of the work of healing and coping. And I wanted to move from a little bit of an abstract description that you were offering there to, you mentioned one specific way, which is the students might engage in like smudging. But I'm just curious, we mentioned this concept of spirituality as being a source of meaning in one's life that energizes a life. And we're starting to talk about how that is a capability of the human, regardless of whether they're affiliated with religious institutions or not. It's a universal capability of the human. How do you see students engaging with what we could call spirituality, what we could call just fullness of being? How do you see them doing that?
Yeah. Well, and I think that's the real balancing act. Because, I started out teaching in tribal schools, right? So our cultural and ceremonial way of life was just part of school. But because of public education, like we always kind of have to walk these fine lines, especially as educators in public education. But I think a lot of it is just normalizing student experience, right? So I think just recognizing and affirming like their experience, like their spiritual experiences, right? In meaningful ways. And that's not something people get to have regardless of who you are, I think, or whatever your cultural or spiritual beliefs may be. It's just like having that affirmation that, I'm not going to feel weird for talking about this. And some of it too is like because when we're talking about settler systems, that it impacts every resource a student can get, right? So they may come to us for like that cultural and academic support, but we're not mental health workers, right? But if the school counselors and the mental health teams there have a traditional Western education, well, they're not going to be able to help that student decolonize their own mental health, right? And so you have all of these sort of systems that have to fall into place. And so I think ultimately, helping students recognize that their culture provides them all the strength that they need, that, when we look outside, like we are surrounded by family, and all the medicines that we need to heal are out there for us to harvest, right? And so some of it is just sometimes asking them, like, when was the last time you had ceremony, right? Because then that's going to mean something different to all of them. But I think what that does is it sort of like triggers that ancestral memory that like we need to take time to be present and to connect. And so for some students that could be like, there might be a river that's really sacred to them, and they take the time, they go down, and they're a completely different student the next day, right? So it's about having that knowledge and experience, and just just letting students know, like, you have everything you need to be powerful. Let's find it.
Yeah, I've seen videos of you in spaces where students are doing, they're maybe doing, they're cooking together. Foods that may or may not be specifically from their tribal affiliation, but they represent a kind of connection and belonging. You're wearing, and I've seen you do crafts with various medicine bags or beads and things like that aren't religious per se, but they're part of fullness of being and identity.
Yeah, well, we have a sense of belonging in the present with each other, right? But we really have this sense of connection that we don't only exist within, like, this spiritual reality and have meaning within it, but we also exist within this continuum of 7 generations back and 7 generations forward. And so that if we kind of recognize sort of the fact that we're surrounded and guided by our ancestors, we're also reminded that we have work to do, because we will be ancestors someday too. So the cultural connection takes many forms. Some of it's food, some of it's it's doing beadwork, and it's also about reconnecting too. It's because of, like, the legacy of colonization, not every student knows about their culture. Like, there have been times, like, our program has been the one that, like, informed a student for the first time that they're Native, right? And that tells a pretty powerful story.
Yeah.
And so, like, being able to kind of mentor and be a resource for those students as they sort of, like, rediscover and unlock who they are is equally powerful, and it takes all sorts of different wonderful ways, such as cooking, and we all know the power of sharing a meal together.
Yeah, the videos I saw of this, they look like they're having so much fun. They look so relaxed, when they're making the food together. Those were some of my favorite moments of looking into your work through the videos that highlight it. And also, as we're talking about this, I came across a quote from you, and this will be a quote, but you talk about wanting to contemporize the Native American experience within this country. That quote just stopped me. I just thought that was such a powerful encapsulation of holding that history, this moment, and then moving forward, like you were just talking about.
Yeah, it's sort of like that old conversation about we need to bury the dead Indian. And by dead Indian, that's sort of like this Americanized stereotypical view of usually, like, a Plains Indian, or a Plains, someone from the Plains tribe, right? We're always in black and white, right? They talk about, we believed this, we ate this, we lived here, they were this, right? And all of that is sort of like painting. It's about historicizing this, right? And sort of the idea of the dead Indian is sort of like that the threat of that historicization. But we see that in fact, because 87% of textbooks don't mention us after 1900, right? And then over half the states don't mention us at all in their learning standards. And so that omission, and being sort of an episodic footnote of American history, continues to damage not only Native people, but all people. And you can't support someone you can't see. And I think contemporizing Native people is, it's so important, but it's also really complex, because there's a lot of deprogramming that non-Native people need to undergo in order to see us. Like, I'm representing today. I'm presenting today, but I don't usually, because I think it's important for me to go into spaces. I was like, I didn't know you were Native. It's like, yeah, this is what we look like. We don't all come feathered and leathered, and so it's really about challenging people's conceptions about us. And I just have the opportunity and the privilege that I can do that as sort of as a disruptor. but also just the very fact that I'm native in spaces is often an intervention to colonialism itself.
Yeah.
But I think it also just celebrates the fact that, we also don't all live in teepees. Like we live in, normal homes or apartments, or we have struggles just like everybody else. We make hit television shows, right? We've helped build the Mars rover. We've been in space, right? So
Pioneers in rock and roll, all kinds of
yeah, exactly. So we have this presence, and we need to, and the fact that that historicization continues keeps our teachers from better engaging students, but it also necessarily impacts federal programming, state programming, identification in connection to services. Our data about Native students is really terrible, and there's a lot of reasons for that. So a lot of it is just making sure we can see each other. But it's great that you bring that up, because most people don't have the time or the opportunity to consider how complex it can be to see a Native person. And so seeing us as vibrant and adaptive and still creating as sovereign people is really impactful as we try to envision a world where we're all closer together in the future.
Well, thank you so much for that. This last as we're beginning to summarize and wrap up with our time today, I just want to really just appreciate what you said previous, that just showing up is a way of disrupting colonization. I appreciate that labor that you do through that, and I just want to recognize that and honor that. As we begin to wrap up, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to share with us something that you might celebrate in your students. What are some gifts and just areas of hope? What do you want to have us know that you celebrate about the students that you work with?
I think so. There's one story that comes to mind that I think illustrates a lot. So, in the course of our Native Studies program, we actively recruit our Native students to participate, right? Because the class is kind of for them, right? But it's open to everyone, and so not everyone feels as comfortable with their identity, right? They may not be as close to that part of who they are as other people, and it's. Yeah, I think of one student in particular that over the course of the program, they became more confident in who they were. They began speaking more. And I remember we had one guest, and I try to normalize for our Native students that, when we're, with company, if you're comfortable, say your name and who your people are, because that's so important. And so we started going around, and the student, just kind of said their name like normal. And then, I introduced myself and who my people were. Another Native student did. And then another Native student. And so they got up, got to their bag, and they had recently talked to their family. And they had written down their tribe's name. And they said, hang on. They rejoined the group and identified publicly as Native, but also as of their people for the first time.
Wow. Yeah.
And I think what's powerful about that in that moment, that not only do I feel confident that we exist in the present, but I know that because of the work that we've done and the sense of identity and growth in that student, I can rest assured that we also exist in the future.
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you for sharing that story. So happy to end on that note as we kind of look ahead. So that's beautiful. Thank you so much for your time today.
It's been a pleasure, and thank you so much for inviting me and opening this conversation up. I think it's a really good one.
Great. And we'll check back in too as time goes on. And again, thank you for being here today for this episode of Lean in Olympia. Again, our guest is Jerad Keopp, who's the Native Student Program Specialist for North Thurston County Public Schools and is also the 2022 Washington State Teacher of the Year. And there's a new Washington State Teacher of the Year already for 2023.
Yep.
But you you will still be doing some duties in this role for the remainder of the year. So we'll keep an eye out for that too. So thanks for being here today. And thank you all for being here today. Peace to you, and we'll see you next time.